He said, I'm telling you right now that probably in about 9 or 10 years I'll be having affairs with other women.
Oh, my God.
The industry sold them as Golden, America's songbird, and the handsome Broadway star who looked like the perfect match. But behind closed doors, Jack Cassidy was living by rules most fans never imagined, and Shirley Jones carried the truth for decades. When she finally spoke, the details stunned even Hollywood. Relationships that crossed the usual lines, whispers about powerful men, and a marriage stretched past its breaking point. How did the image stay spotless for so long? And what did it cost the people inside it? In the mid-1950s, when Shirley Jones married Jack Cassidy, it looked like a dream. She was the golden girl of stage and screen, dazzling audiences with beloved musicals. He was the charismatic Broadway star whose voice and looks made him the kind of man women adored and men admired. Together, they seemed pulled from a Hollywood fantasy. Photos showed bright smiles, stylish clothes, and a family portrait fit for magazines. They had 3 sons, and Shirley became stepmother to David Cassidy, who would later find fame of his own. To fans, they were untouchable, the picture-perfect family America loved to believe in. But that portrait was only one layer of the truth. Shirley soon sensed cracks in her marriage. Jack's charm and magnetism carried shadows that grew harder to ignore. His unpredictability, hunger for attention, and restless energy created an undercurrent of turbulence behind closed doors. Friends who visited their home noticed moments of tension, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore over time. Shirley later admitted the illusion was carefully maintained, for the public and for herself. She wanted to believe in the fairy tale. For a time, she did. Yet, the early years showed signs Jack would not live by the rules others expected. His attention wandered, his impulses ruled, and the line between performance and reality blurred. What fans saw as a confident star was, to Shirley, a man who rarely stood still, always chasing the next thrill. Still, she endured. The world adored their image, and she feared the questions that truth would bring. In an era when stars were expected to project perfection, revealing chaos at home was unthinkable. So she smiled for the cameras, raised her children, and clung to the dream. But beneath the glamour, Jack Cassidy was already living by very different rules. Rules Shirley would one day reveal. When Shirley Jones finally told her story decades later, she revealed details that went far beyond what anyone had expected. According to her, Jack Cassidy's private life included relationships not only with women, but also with men. In a time when Hollywood kept such matters buried under layers of silence, Shirley's admission cut through decades of carefully protected image-making. The name that drew the most attention was Cole Porter, the legendary composer and songwriter. Porter, himself known in elite circles for a hidden personal life, was one of the men Shirley claimed her husband had been involved with. It was a disclosure that made headlines, not just because of Jack's stature, but because it rewrote how fans remembered the Cassidy household altogether. This revelation did not come as speculation or third-hand rumor. Shirley said it plainly in her memoir, almost casually, as though this long-kept secret had become too heavy to carry. She was not repeating gossip. She was acknowledging reality. For decades, the public thought of Jack Cassidy as the dashing star who broke women's hearts. Few imagined he also sought companionship in other places, with powerful figures who shaped the entertainment industry itself. The glamour of their marriage had always been public property, but now Shirley was pulling back the curtain on a different kind of intimacy, one that had existed out of view and out of time. Her account was later supported by her stepson, David Cassidy, who admitted in interviews and his own book that his father was indeed bisexual. David described Jack as a man of intense appetites, someone who was never fully satisfied with limits. For David, growing up with such a father meant navigating contradictions, adoration from fans on one side, and erratic, sometimes confusing behavior at home on the other. When Shirley's memoir aligned with David's confessions, the story no longer looked like scandal for scandal's sake. It looked like confirmation of a truth the family had quietly carried all along. The idea that Jack Cassidy, the Broadway matinee idol, could also have been entangled with someone as towering as Cole reporter, reshaped the narrative of his life. It turned whispers into testimony. It challenged the myth of the simple Hollywood love story and revealed how layered human desires can be when stripped of image and expectation. For Shirley, sharing this truth was not about humiliation. It was about finally speaking openly about what had always been just beneath the surface of her marriage. But her acceptance did not mean she was untouched by the cost. What she agreed to in private came with pressures no amount of glamour could erase. And the next stage of her story would prove that the bargains she made in love could never truly hold back the storms waiting just ahead. What made Shirley Jones's story compelling was not just what she revealed about Jack Cassidy's double life, but how she chose to live with it. By her own account, she knew about his infidelities early. She was not naive. Jack's charm, restlessness, and magnetism drew people to him constantly. Women, men, strangers, colleagues, it hardly mattered. The attention was endless, and the temptations never far away. Shirley admitted she understood the kind of man she had married, and instead of leaving after the first betrayal, she tried to adjust. Her memoir described one striking episode that made headlines. Jack persuaded her to join a threesome, an idea she agreed to, but later summed up with one word: yuck. The story startled readers not only because it clashed with her wholesome image, but because of her blunt honesty. She made it clear the experience left her uncomfortable, even diminished. For Shirley, this was not glamorous experimentation. It was compromise, and compromise left scars. Why did she endure? She explained it as love and loyalty, but also circumstance. She was a young mother with children to raise and a career still growing. In the Hollywood of the 1960s, divorce was not easily accepted. For an Oscar winner and television star, the pressure to keep appearances was enormous. Ending the marriage too soon might have invited scandal, and Shirley was not ready to risk it. She was determined to keep her family intact, even if it meant turning a blind eye to behavior that hurt her deeply. For Jack, the bargains worked in the short term. He had the freedom to pursue his impulses, while Shirley anchored the family. But this was not balance. It was surrender. The longer she tolerated his behavior, the more emboldened he became. What she intended as love and preservation slowly eroded the trust between them. She could excuse incidents, but the pattern never stopped. The more she gave, the more he took. Accommodation bought time, but not peace. The marriage became a stage performance, convincing to outsiders, hollow within. Shirley may have smiled for the cameras, but inside she wrestled with humiliation, doubt, and the realization that no matter how much she sacrificed, Jack would never change. And soon, what had been whispered behind closed doors would spill into moments that could no longer be contained. For years, Shirley Jones managed to keep her husband's infidelities and double life hidden behind the curtain of Hollywood glamour. But even the most polished illusions begin to fray, and Jack Cassidy's restless appetites eventually became harder to disguise. What Shirley had tolerated in private often pushed its way into public moments that left her feeling exposed. Parties, industry gatherings, and even casual evenings out became settings where Jack's behavior drew whispers. He was magnetic, yes, but his charm could turn reckless. Flirtations became obvious, stories spread, and the image of the perfect couple began to blur at the edges. The 1960s and 70s were decades of social change, and the entertainment industry was not immune to those shifts. Swinging lifestyles, experimental relationships, and a loosening of boundaries were becoming part of Hollywood's backstage reality. But while others embraced those changes privately, Shirley carried the burden of seeing her marriage turned into gossip fodder. When she stood beside Jack at public events, she knew what many did not. The man on her arm was also the man whose indiscretions left her struggling to hold the family together. Every compliment about their perfect love story stung just a little deeper. In her memoir, Shirley described how difficult it became to pretend that she was not aware. She was too intelligent, too perceptive to believe the act herself. But the public image mattered. Studios, producers, and even fans wanted the fantasy. She was still America's sweetheart, and Jack was still the Broadway star turned leading man. To admit otherwise would have broken the spell that kept them in the spotlight. So Shirley endured the charade, knowing that her silence protected their reputations even as it eroded her spirit. What made it worse was Jack's complete lack of discretion at times. His need for attention meant that he often disregarded boundaries in ways that humiliated her. The very charisma that had drawn her to him in the first place was the same quality that left her standing quietly in the background while he basked in adoration from someone else, sometimes right in front of her. For Shirley, this was no longer just about private compromise, it was public disrespect, and it hurt in ways that could not be easily erased. The mask had slipped, and although the wider world might not have seen the full picture yet, the cost was becoming undeniable inside the family. The strains were not confined to Shirley and Jack alone. Their children were growing up in the shadow of a marriage that looked perfect on screen but was filled with tension at home. And the one who would later speak most openly about it was David Cassidy, whose own fame would rise as his father's life grew more chaotic. Behind every glamorous photo of Shirley Jones and Jack Cassidy was a household where children quietly absorbed the turbulence of their parents' marriage. They had 3 sons together, Sean, Patrick, and Ryan, while Shirley also became stepmother to David Cassidy from Jack's earlier marriage. To the outside world, this blended family looked like a dynasty in the making. Inside, it was far more complicated. David would later become one of the biggest teen idols of the 1970s through the Partridge Family, where Shirley played his on-screen mother. Millions adored him, but in memoirs and interviews, David revealed the pain of living under Jack's shadow. He described his father as brilliant, yet volatile, capable of great affection one moment and destructive impulses the next. He also spoke openly about Jack's bisexuality, a truth that added to the complexity of their family life. For David, the glamour of famous parents was overshadowed by instability and distance. Shirley tried to hold the family together, balancing her career with motherhood while shielding her children from Jack's excesses. But the burden was heavy. The lies, the betrayals, and the late nights were not invisible. The children noticed, even if they stayed silent. Sean, who later built his own career, often reflected on fame as both gift and curse. Patrick and Ryan, too, felt the strain of being raised in a household where appearances mattered more than honesty. Their father's charisma was undeniable, but so was the damage. For Shirley, the greatest pain was realizing her efforts to protect the family only exposed her children to deeper instability. As the children grew, each found a way to define themselves apart from the myth of perfection. David chose to speak most openly, breaking the silence that had defined his childhood. Sean channeled his energy into creativity. Patrick leaned toward acting and producing, and Ryan pursued his own quieter path. Each carried memories of a father both dazzling and destructive, and of a mother who tried desperately to hold a fragile family together. Their reflections, combined with Shirley's later revelations, showed just how much the Cassidy legacy was built not only on talent and glamour, but also on hidden pain. By the mid-1970s, the strain could no longer be hidden. The Cassidy marriage, once painted as Hollywood perfection, was unraveling in ways no smile could disguise. The decisions that followed would end their union, but not their story. By the mid-1970s, Shirley Jones had reached the point where silence was no longer possible. For nearly 2 decades, she had endured Jack Cassidy's affairs, his unpredictable moods, and the slow erosion of their partnership. What began as compromise for the sake of family and image had become an exhausting cycle of humiliation and heartbreak. The woman who once believed she could hold it all together realized that no amount of patience could save a marriage built on secrets. In 1975, Shirley filed for divorce. On the surface, the split seemed almost inevitable, but for those who had believed in the perfect couple image, it was a shock. Newspapers reported it simply, listing irreconcilable differences as the reason. But the truth was layered. Jack's infidelities, his growing dependence on alcohol, and the deep emotional wounds that years of betrayal had left behind. For Shirley, it was not just a legal separation. It was a declaration that she would no longer live within the illusion. The divorce was finalized later that year, and with it came a painful new chapter. Shirley was suddenly a single mother to 3 sons, balancing her career with the responsibility of raising them in the aftermath of turmoil. She had fame, but fame did not erase the loneliness or the sense of failure she carried. Friends described her as resilient, but Shirley admitted later that those years tested her strength more than any film role ever had. For Jack, the end of the marriage did not mean a quiet fade from the spotlight. He remained active in theater and television, but his life grew increasingly chaotic. Reports of drinking, erratic behavior, and professional conflicts painted the picture of a man spiraling. The charisma was still there. He could still command a stage or light up a room, but beneath it, the cracks were widening. Even as he continued to perform, those closest to him knew he was struggling. Yet, despite everything, Shirley never spoke with bitterness about Jack during this time. She acknowledged his faults, but she also spoke of his brilliance, his talent, and the parts of him that had captivated her from the very beginning. The divorce was painful, but it did not erase her love for the man he had been, or her sorrow for the man he was becoming. Ending the marriage was not the end of the story. If anything, it only set the stage for a final chapter that would be more tragic and more haunting than anyone could have anticipated. Because Jack Cassidy's life, already defined by extremes, was heading toward an ending that would leave Shirley, their children, and the entire entertainment world stunned. For all of Jack Cassidy's brilliance, his final years were shadowed by turmoil. After the divorce, he lived alone, his career continuing but without the stability he once had in Shirley and the family home. Friends and colleagues noticed the changes. He drank heavily, his moods swung unpredictably, and the same hunger for excitement that once made him magnetic now seemed to push him into dangerous territory. What had once been described as charming eccentricity increasingly looked like a man unraveling. By December of 1976, the descent had become impossible to ignore. On the night of December 12th, after attending a party in Los Angeles, Jack returned to his apartment. What happened next would make headlines across the country. Firefighters were called to the building when flames engulfed the unit. Inside, they found Jack's body. He was only 49 years old. Investigators later reported that the fire was caused by a cigarette left burning on a couch, a tragic accident compounded by alcohol use. The man who had once lit up Broadway and Hollywood had perished in a blaze of his own making. For Shirley Jones, the news was devastating. She had divorced Jack to save herself and her children from further pain, but she had never stopped caring about him. She spoke later about how the loss struck her with a mix of grief and unfinished business. There were conversations they had never had, apologies that had never been spoken, and a kind of closure that could never arrive once the flames had taken him. She mourned not only the man she had once loved, but also the father of her children, and the partner with whom she had shared nearly 20 years of her life. The Cassidy children were equally shaken. David, already in the spotlight, struggled with his father's death while trying to keep his own career afloat. Sean, Patrick, and Ryan were younger, but the memory of their father's volatility mixed with the trauma of his sudden absence. For them, Jack's death was not just a headline. It was the abrupt ending of a complicated relationship they would carry for the rest of their lives. Even in death, Jack Cassidy remained a figure of contradictions. Obituaries praised his talent, his charisma, and his achievements on stage and screen. But those who knew him personally remembered the instability, the betrayals, and the demons that had haunted him until the very end. For Shirley, the fire closed the chapter of her marriage, but left her with a story that felt unfinished. She had survived, she had moved forward, but the truth of what she had endured remained largely unspoken for decades. And then, nearly 40 years later, Shirley Jones finally decided to tell everything. The glamour, the betrayals, the shocking secrets, and her revelations would once again place the Cassidy name in headlines. For nearly 4 decades after Jack Cassidy's death, Shirley Jones kept silent about the truth she had lived. She moved on, marrying comedian Marty Ingalls in 1977, raising her children, and continuing her career. To the public, she remained the beloved star of Oklahoma, The Music Man, and the Partridge Family. But behind that image, she carried memories of a marriage far more complicated than the fairy tale people believed. It was not until 2013, with the release of her memoir, Shirley Jones, that she finally spoke openly. The book stunned readers. With blunt honesty, she revealed Jack's double life, affairs with women and men, ties to figures like Cole Porter, and moments she admitted she regretted. She did not dramatize the stories, she told them plainly, as truths she had carried too long. For America's on-screen sweetheart, this was an act of striking vulnerability. Headlines quickly followed. Media outlets focused on her disclosures about Jack's bisexuality, her account of a failed threesome, and her reflections on years of chaos. Some were shocked, others sympathetic. sympathetic, but many admired her courage. What could have been dismissed as scandal was instead seen as liberation, a woman in her 70s reclaiming her story. Shirley made clear she was not trying to tear down Jack's legacy. She still admired his talent and remembered the charm that had first captivated her. But she wanted the full picture told, the betrayals, the instability, and the price she and her children had paid for preserving an illusion. In interviews, she explained her goal was honesty, not shame. After years of silence, she no longer felt bound to protect an image that had never been real. For fans, her revelations reframed one of Hollywood's most glamorous couples. Red carpet photographs now looked different when seen against the truth. It was a reminder that even the brightest stars carry shadows, and that love, fame, and success never erase human flaws. Her candor brought her closer to audiences, not as a flawless icon, but as a woman who endured, survived, and finally chose to tell her story. Her confession was not just for the world, it was for herself. After decades of carrying the weight, Shirley gave herself permission to speak. And in doing so, she ensured the truth about Jack Cassidy. Their marriage and their family would never be buried beneath Hollywood's polished myths. Do you think her late revelations change the way Jack Cassidy should be remembered? Or do they simply show how human even the brightest stars really are? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed uncovering this story, make sure to subscribe for more untold Hollywood histories.